What's going on, guys, and welcome back to yet another Touchdowns to Home Runs. We have an amazing video out for you guys today because today I will be breaking down my predictions for the Big 12. Yes, going from teams 10 to 1 all the way, ranking each team and how I feel the teams will finish up at the end of the Big 12 season. Now, the Big 12 as a total is getting so much of a better of a conference, in my opinion, especially on the defensive side of the ball. We've seen years prior, the Big 12, obviously, the stereotype being around the Big 12's defenses are terrible. That's why the scoring is always so high. That's why you always have such amazing offenses in the Big 12, because there's no defense. You look at the national rankings last year and you look at where these teams finished out in total defense, which we will get into a bit later in the video today, talking about certain teams. But the Big 12 as a conference is definitely getting better as a defensive conference. And offensively, I still think you have some of the best offenses in the whole country in the Big 12. So we're in for a very, very interesting video today, guys. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this one. Coming in dead last at number 10th on our list, this should be no surprise to anyone, but we do have the Kansas Jayhawks. I mean, what else is there to say about the Kansas Jayhawks? This team did not win a single game in 2020. This team finished dead last in the Big 12 in total offense and total defense. This team only put up 15.8 yards per game throughout the whole season. There was not many bright spots at all for this Kansas team going throughout the 2020 season and going into this season. Obviously, there's a huge coaching change. Not much to expect this season at all from Kansas. One of their only bright spots, you look at Karan Prutney, is now transferred to my South Carolina Gamecocks, which I am absolutely thrilled. That news actually just broke out yesterday. I was thrilled that we got an all-American freshman coming into Columbia, South Carolina, especially when we need better secondary players. So I am completely thrilled about that. But this Kansas team, I just do not know where the bright spot and where to look at really for this team. So I think that there's no surprise that this team should be at number 10. They're going through a coaching change. There's still lots to change about this program before you start to see this team being a contender in the Big 12. Coming in at number 9 on my list, I have the Texas Tech Red Raiders. Now, Texas Tech last season finished 4-6. In their wins, in their 4 wins against Houston Baptist, you look at Baylor, you look at West Virginia, and you look at Kansas, those were all one-score ball games. So it's not like in those games that Texas Tech won, they're very dominant wins, and they're very easy wins for Texas Tech. They had to struggle, they had to get through, they had to grind to be able to get those wins. Now, looking at their defense last season, bottom line is this team let up way too many points and they were way too weak on the ball defensively. This team finished second last in total defense in the Big 12. This team gave up around 445 yards per game defensively and around like 36 points per game. Bottom line is that is not going to get you anywhere in the Big 12. If you want to be good in the Big 12 nowadays, you got to have a tight defense. You got to have a defense that is willing to make some stops. So I think that that's Texas Tech real struggle going into this season. Now, offensively, you look at offensively, especially last season, I think this team was probably in the top half of the Big 12, especially passing wise. They bring in a new transfer quarterback in Tyler Show. Excited to see how he works with this offense as Texas Tech tries to rebuild themselves as a program to get back to the top half of the Big 12. Overall this season, I think Texas Tech offensively will be decent. They'll do some things. They'll put points up on the board and everything like that. It's just that defense that is really, really scaring me in saying that Texas Tech will be a top tier Big 12 team coming up this season, or a top half Big 12 team this season. So that is why I have them falling back to the number 9 spot. Coming in at number 4, I have the Kansas State Wildcats. Now, Kansas State last season obviously opened up the gates very, very hot, and they had an amazing start, winning 4 of their first 5 games, but then finished off the season with a 5-game losing streak in the Big 12, which is obviously not good. So riding into this 2021 season, Kansas State currently has a 5-game losing streak. This team, offensively and defensively, both had the 8th total offense and defense last season in the Big 12. Now, that's kind of ironic that I put this team at number 8, but last season they did finish 8th in both of those categories. Offensively this season, I expect things to be much better. Skylar Thompson obviously coming back, a very experienced quarterback. Excited to see what he can do over there in Kansas State this season. Deuce Vaughn obviously being one of the best all-purpose backs in all the country coming into this season. He's going to be one of the most exciting players in all of the Big 12 this season. So very, very excited to see what he can do for Kansas State this season. You'll have Knowles and Taylor at the wide receiver position. So offensively, I expect this team to definitely not be the 8th total offense in the Big 12 this season. Definitely major improvements to be made there. I'm looking at the defensive side of the ball, and that's where my concern is kind of for this Kansas State team. Obviously, this team loses lots of talents from last season. You look at Elijah Sullivan, you look at Wyatt Herbert, you look at Justin Hughes, those 3 guys all gone and many, many more guys for Kansas State. You're going to have some experience, some returning experience still left on this Kansas State defense, but that's where my main concern is right now. If this team last year, before even losing all those guys, was the 8th total defense in the Big 12, where are they going to be this season? So that is the main reason why I have Kansas State at my number 8 spot. Next up on my list at number 7, I have the Baylor Bears. Now, Baylor last season, in all honesty, was not a very, very good team at all. Obviously, this team goes 2-7, finishes definitely towards the bottom of the Big 12, did not have a very strong season at all. But I think Baylor returns a lot of experience this year. Especially I look on the defensive side of the ball. That's where I see Baylor being really, really strong this year. And I think that they'll be able to flip some of those games that were losses last season into wins, and that should bring them up a bit. I'm not saying that they'll rise a ton in the Big 12 standings, but it should rise them a bit, so that's why I have them at number 7. Now, looking at this Baylor offense, obviously last year you have Charlie Brewer as your starting quarterback. He transfers out, so now you're either going to have Bohannon or Zeno at your starting quarterback position. You look at the wide receiver position for Baylor this season. RJ Sneed, I'm expecting him to be the main wide receiver going on this season, but then you also have Thornton out there as well, a returning experienced starter that you're going to have on the outside for Baylor on the wide receiver position. So I'm looking at those two guys to go out and have big seasons. Looking at Treston Ebner, I'm expecting him to not only have a breakout season, obviously he's one of the best kick returners in all of college football, but also at the running back position, looking for him to do big things this season. So there are some minor things to look forward to and be optimistic about this Baylor offense this season. It's not a ton. There's definitely still tons of work to be done on the offensive side of the ball, but defense, switching on to defense, this is where I'm very, very excited for and very optimistic why Baylor will do better than they did last season. Baylor returns tons of experience on this defense. They return 9 of 11 starters, and all of their linebackers, of course, that is depending on where you classify Bradley King playing. Obviously, he was either defensive end or linebacker, whatever you classify that as, but you're returning all of your linebackers. And on top of that, I just think that experience that Baylor will have defensively will help them so much this season. Their coaches have said that this is no team that is starting from ground zero, that this team will go out and have a very, very successful year this year because they know the defense. So I'm expecting Baylor not to jump up a ton in the Big 12 standings, but have a good enough season to rise them up a few spots and get some extra wins this season and not go 2-7 again. Coming up at number 6 on my list, I have the Oklahoma State Cowboys. Now, this may come to a big shock for a lot of people, especially Oklahoma State fans. But Oklahoma State coming into last season, was obviously a playoff contender, a team that many, many, many people considered to be the best team in the Big 12 going into that season. I didn't buy really any of the hype. I didn't think that Oklahoma State was the best team in the Big 12, but they started off the season pretty good, winning all of their first 4 games until a overtime game versus Texas that I called. I don't want to brag, but I did call that game. An overtime game versus Texas obviously led them to fall back in the AP standings. A loss to Oklahoma in Oklahoma obviously killed them, as they only put up like 13 points in that game, and then they also lost to TCU. Obviously found them playing in the Cheez-It Bowl, where they'd go on and beat the Miami Hurricanes. But other than that, Oklahoma State, they did decent. Obviously, they were disappointing. Obviously, they were supposed to do better because their schedule was going to be way more favorable if they played what they originally had on their schedule rather than the schedule that they did have. They were probably going to be a 10-team win team last season. But you look at this Oklahoma State team going into this year, what really, really scares me about Oklahoma State and their offense is their passing game especially. Now, Spencer Sanders comes back for the season. I'm not a huge Spencer Sanders guy, but a lot of people think that he's one of the best quarterbacks in all of college football going into the season. Definitely a top 2-tier guy in all of college football. And I wouldn't argue with you. I think that he is an amazing passer. He also got some ground game. He's an amazing quarterback. But you look at the passing game, you lose Tylan Wallace, your big wide receiver, and you look at going into last season, all the talk was why this team's going to be so successful. You're going to have Tylan Wallace, you're going to have Spencer Sanders, and you're going to have Chuba Hubbard all on the same offense. Now, Chuba, he's Canadian like me. I'm from Canada, so I love Chuba and everything. Obviously went to the Panthers. He did okay last season. I expected him to have a bit of a better season than he did have, but he still did okay. Tylan Wallace obviously is a huge loss for Oklahoma State. And not only that, but they're also losing Stoner and Wolf. They're 2 other leading receivers for Oklahoma State last season. So this passing offense, which was their main source of yardage last season for Oklahoma State, is going to take a bit of a step back, losing your 3 top receivers, and you're also losing one of your better running backs. I know that doesn't have to do with the passing game, but now talking about the rushing game, going into that, You do lose Chuba, which I know, big loss. Chuba was an amazing player, but I look at the other two guys that were also on this roster last season. You look at LD Brown and then you look at Desmond Jackson. Both of those guys put up some seriously good numbers under Chuba Hubbard last season, so I wouldn't be too afraid of the rushing game. Looking at the running back position in general, I know you look at the offensive line, you took a hit, obviously losing Tevin Jenkins, who went to my Chicago Bears, which I am absolutely thrilled about, but Tevin Jenkins was one of the best offensive linemen in all of college football last season. Now, there were a bunch of guys on Oklahoma State due to injury last year that got experience going in at the offensive lineman position last year for Oklahoma State because guys got injured. So it's not going to be terrible last season. Obviously, losing Tevin Jenkins is going to kill, but I think the rushing game will ultimately be okay for Oklahoma State. Defensively as well, I think Oklahoma State will still remain as a top half team in all of the Big 12. They return 8 of 11 starters next season for Oklahoma State, which is going to be huge, and I expect them, of course, to stay a top half team in the Big 12 defensively. Now, why I'm so low on this team and why I have them at number 6, which number 6 is still a relatively good spot. It's not like I'm putting this team at number 8. I still respect Oklahoma State, but this team plays some really, really tough road games. They travel to Ames, Iowa. They travel to Morgantown, West Virginia. They have to travel to Austin, Texas. Obviously, those three games are going to be tough to win. They get Oklahoma at home, but I still think Oklahoma is a much better team this season. So you got those 3 tough road tests and scoring on the road against compatible opponents. I put compatible opponents because obviously they ran the score up against, I think they played at Kansas last year and at Baylor, which they ran the scoreboard up, but scoring against Oklahoma last season and against Kansas State, I think they only put up 20 against Kansas State and they only put up 13 against Oklahoma. They need to learn how to score on the road, so that really kind of worries me going into the season for Oklahoma State. Again, that passing attack, I think, is going to take a huge step back and something that I'm really, really worried about for Oklahoma State, and that's why I ultimately have them at the number 6 position. I don't think that they're going to be a terrible team, but I don't think that they're at the level that they were last year in terms of talent, in terms of offensive productivity. I still think it will be there in the rushing game, but we all know in the Big 12 you have to have a really, really good passing attack, and I just don't honestly know if it's there yet. I can still see it in the season. They could go out and have an amazing passing attack, but in this current point in time, I just need to see more from Oklahoma State for me to feel really, really confident in calling that. Coming in at number 5, this may be a shock for some people because of how high I'm actually putting this team, but I am putting the West Virginia Mountaineers coming in at my number 5 spot in the Big 12. West Virginia last season going 6-4. This team was very inconsistent. Some weeks they looked really, really good, and other weeks they just did not look good at all. Obviously, this team finishes out in 6-4, and they had pick up a bowl win at the end of the season, picking up, I'm pretty sure, a Liberty Bowl against Army, finishing off the season strong. Taking a quick look at this offense going into the season before we take a look at the defense. Offensively, the offense was okay. This team put up about 26.5 points per game, which obviously needs to increase, which I think obviously will increase this season. I think a lot of experience returns to this West Virginia offense, which will help. You're returning your starting quarterback. Jared Dagey is returning. Last season, he had an okay season, throwing 14 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. Obviously, you like how little interceptions he threw. Touchdowns, I think, could increase a bit. He did look inconsistent in that last game against Army, but hopefully he gets back to being consistent for the rest of this season and going forward. You look at the running back position, Letty Brown is going to be one of the best running backs in all of the Big 12 this year, which is saying a lot because you have some really talented running backs in the Big 12. You look at guys like Breece Hall, you look at Bijan Robinson, you look at Eric Gray, you look at Kennedy Brooks, you look at Deuce Vaughn. Letty Brown is right up there with those guys. He rushed for over 1,000 yards last season, which should help this West Virginia offense extremely in the rushing game. They are going to be very successful this season. So offensively, I'm expecting them to get better. They weren't the greatest last season at all in the Big 12, but I think they will get better. Now, defensively, this was one of the best defenses, not only in the Big 12, which they did finish number 1 in total defense in the Big 12. This is one of the best defenses in all of college football last season. This team finished number 1 in passing defense last season and was at least top 25 in all other categories for the rest of the season. Like, this defense was legit last season. Now, this team does return only 6 of 11 starters. Now, you do return more than half, but they lose some really, really key guys. You lose Stills, you lose Fields, and then you lose Smith, who obviously transfers to Georgia. But I still think West Virginia will definitely have a top-tier defense in the Big 12. I'm not saying that they'll be at the same level that they were last year. I'm not saying that they'll be at Oklahoma's level. I still think that this West Virginia defense will be very, very solid going into this season. So I'm excited for West Virginia this season. I think they play a very, very favorable home schedule. They get Virginia Tech at home. They get Texas at home. They get Iowa State at home. They get Oklahoma State at home. You do have to travel to teams like Maryland early, which should be an interesting game because Maryland was kind of inconsistent last year, but Tulia Tagovailoa, let's see how he does this year because he showed some promise for Maryland last season. You have to go to Oklahoma and you have to go to TCU, but overall, I think West Virginia will finish in the top half of the Big 12. I'm excited to see what they can do this year, so give me West Virginia at number 5. Coming in at my number 4 spot, I have the TCU Horned Frogs. Now, TCU last season went 6-4, but I think that this is definitely one of the best improving programs in all of the Big 12. Max Duggan will lead the Horned Frogs yet again at the quarterback position for the TCU Horned Frogs this season. He did throw for 10 touchdowns last season, which isn't amazing, but he matched that with 10 rushing touchdowns as well and 500-plus yards. So Max Duggan is going to be one of the most experienced quarterbacks that TCU has had in recent history, probably since Trevon Boykin, and one of the most experienced in all the Big 12 this season, looking at being one of the best in all the Big 12. So lots of good stuff to look at for Max Duggan this season at TCU. The rest of the offense, I think there is tons of optimism and tons of good things to be looked at for this TCU offense because you land all 4 of your leading receivers back on the offense, looking especially at Tate Barber, who's going to be the lead guy for that receiving corps in TCU. So hopefully he can go out and have a breakout season with Max Duggan. He only caught for like 2 touchdowns last season, so I hope that that number increases. But overall, returning all 4 of your leading receivers is going to be absolutely huge for TCU next season. But not only that, returning your 5 best rushers in the number 1 rushing offense in all the Big 12 last season is going to be absolutely huge for the Horned Frogs this season. So lots to look forward to. Obviously, Max Duggan was the leading rusher for TCU last season, but you also look at guys like Barlow, tons of other talent on that rushing core for TCU going into next season. Now you look at defensively, TCU was one of the best in all the Big 12 last season, and I think that that should continue. Although you do lose a couple guys in your secondary, especially you look at Moehrig at the safety position, obviously being one of the best NFL prospects in the secondary for this NFL draft that just happened. The entire D-line returns for TCU in the rushing defense that only gave up 127 rushing yards per game last season, and that was 20th in the nation. So lots to look forward to. And for the rushing defense with TCU, experience and proven success and everything like that leads me to believe that TCU will be a very successful team this year and stay atop of the top half of the Big 12 this season. They do come into the season. Many think that they are a top 25 team. Will they finish out a top 25 team? We'll have to see. But overall, right now, I think TCU is in a really, really good spot. At number 3, I have the Texas Longhorns. Now, Texas Longhorns obviously go out and make the biggest hire of the whole college football offseason, getting Steve Sarkisian to be their head coach for next season, which obviously being Alabama's OC, I think will be one of the greatest offensive minds in all of college football for the next coming years. So I love that Texas hire. I wish he would have came to South Carolina. Obviously, I'm a big South Carolina Gamecocks fan, but I am completely fine with Shane Beamer. We are going to be very successful with him. But let's not talk about South Carolina. Let's go back to talking about Texas. Texas, offensively, let's start off offensively. You're going to have a new starting quarterback in Casey Thompson. Now, Casey Thompson was very highly recruited. Lots of talent in Casey Thompson, but again, he's still going to be starting out in his first season. He's still going to be making some rookie, quote-unquote, freshman mistakes. Even though he is not a freshman, you're going to make those first starting season mistakes at points of the season for Casey Thompson. Now, the good thing for him is he has tons of talent around him to be successful this season. You're returning 4 of 5 starters on the offensive line, which is going to be absolutely huge for them. You look at the rushing game, you have one of the best running backs in all of college football behind you in Bijan Robinson, who should have one of the most successful seasons in the Big 12 rushing, in college football rushing, in Power 5, whatever you want to call it. Bijan Robinson is up there with Breece Hall. He's up there with Isaiah Spiller. He's up there with Kevin Harris. All of those main running backs that you see in college football, Bijan Robinson is always, his name is always up there in the top 5. So you're going to have help there. Wide receiver position, you're looking at the guys that you're going to throw the ball to. Obviously, you'll lose Brennan Eagles last season, but you're going to still have Josh Moore. You're still going to have Jake Smith. You're still going to have lots of talent and guys to throw to the ball to for Casey Thompson. So overall, I think he's going to be the main focal point of this offense, and how he performs is really going to shift how this Texas offense does. But he has the talent around him, and he has the support around him to have a really, really successful first year. Now, looking at the defense, I think the defense overall is solid. I think you have a decent D-line, you have a decent linebacking core, and you have a decent secondary. You return some of your starters. You return 6 of 11 starters, which obviously is more than half. You'd still like to have it more than over that. But the main guys I'm looking at this season for Texas on the defensive side of the ball, I'm looking at DeMarvin Overshone. Really excited to see what he can do at the linebacking position. And then Deshaun Jameson as well in the secondary. I'm really excited to see what those guys can do. You look at the secondary, of course. You got 3 guys, especially you look at your safety position. You got a bunch of guys who weren't starters last season, but you got seniors. You got experience out there. You got guys who have been in this program for a long time, so lots to look forward to there. Overall, my opinions on Texas this season, they're still going through a coaching change. I think we need to remember that. As talented as Texas is, they're still going through a coaching change. So things aren't going to be 100% perfect this season, and they're not going to be as good as some people think that they're going to be. I still think that this team will be really good. I just think that there are 2 teams right now, in my current opinion, that are over top of them and that just have a bit of an edge experience-wise, and in terms of they just got everything figured out. Like, let's not forget, Texas is still going through a coaching change. Now, I still think Texas will be really, really successful this season. There'll still be a lot of opportunities to test how successful and what direction this Texas program is going in. You look at their schedule. They start off the season against a very competitive Group of 5 team in the Louisiana Raging Cajuns, which will be a very exciting game. Then week 2, they travel to Arkansas, which I think Arkansas is a decent team. I still think Texas is a better team, but you're going to be going to a harsh environment going to Arkansas. So let's see how you can coach up your young quarterback to play in that game. Let's see how you can get that offense to travel in that week 2 game. There are lots of games to see what direction this Texas program will be traveling in, and then obviously looking at how they do in the Big 12. How will you be able to compete with your Oklahomas, your Iowa States? How will you be able to compete with TCU, Oklahoma State? Teams like that this season will really tell what direction Texas is going in this season. Overall, I think they're the third best team in the Big 12 this season, but I think they are definitely trending towards the way that they want to go. Coming in at my number 2 spot, I have the Iowa State Cyclones. Now, Iowa State coming into the season is one of the top 10 teams in all of college football coming in. Many people have them in the top 10. Many people have them contending for the college football playoff this season because, in all honesty, this team is that good. And you look at experience and returning starters is a huge focal point for Iowa State this season. You have 10 of 11 returning starters on offense and 9 of 11 returning on defense this season. So returning starters is obviously going to be there. Let's start off by talking about this offense. First of all, let's start off with Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy is one of the better quarterbacks in the Big 12 this season. He's obviously one of the most experienced. He did have his spurts last season where he was a bit inconsistent in some games, but overall, I think Brock Purdy had an amazing season last year, and I think he will continue to lead Iowa State in the right direction this year. Running back position, who are we going to talk about other than Breece Hall? I mean, Breece Hall is, for the most part, the best running back in all of college football. You go onto most websites, you go onto most credible sources for college football news, and they will say Breece Hall is the best running back in all of college football. Rushed for over 1,500 yards last season. He's a Heisman favorite going into this season. Lots to look forward to for Breece Hall. You look at guys like Charlie Kohler at the tight end position. So much talent all across the board on this offense for Iowa State, and they're going to go out and have a big season like they did last year. Defensively, again, same thing. I mentioned it. They returned 9 of 11 starters. The main guy that you're going to look at this season is Mike Rose at the linebacker position for Iowa State. All in all, what you're really focusing on for this Iowa State team is, can you get to that Oklahoma game in your second last week of the regular season undefeated? That's honestly it, because you kind of had your quote-unquote mistake games last year, games that you probably should have won, but you didn't end up winning. So you look at Louisiana. Now, Louisiana did end up being a much better team than you thought they were in that week 1 game. So that game wasn't as bad of a loss as it looked after they won that game, but I still think Iowa State should have won that game against Louisiana. Obviously, that was the first game of the season, but you can't lose your first game of the season if you want to make the college football playoff and then continue to lose 2 games after that. You have to be almost perfect. So you got to go up into that Oklahoma week perfect. Just looking at their schedule right here, I have it right here. You play out of conference, you play Northern Iowa, you play Iowa, which is going to be a big game. Iowa is always a competitive team. That will be an interesting game. You go to UNLV, so that is going to be at Allegiant Stadium, and then you just play the rest of your regular Big 12 schedule. Can you get through those games? Can you get your Oklahoma State games? Can you get your games going to West Virginia? Can you get your games going to Kansas State? Games like that. Texas, you get Texas at home. Can you get out of all of those games with a win and get into that Oklahoma game scot-free? So you are setting yourself in a good position to make the Big 12 championship and then really be a contender for the college football playoff. That's what Iowa State's going to be looking at this season. I think they're definitely a top 10 team in all of college football. They have the talent. They have the experience. Can they match up with Oklahoma is going to be the big question for the Cyclones this season. Finishing up at my number 1 spot, I think it's obvious. If you go through process of elimination, I obviously have the Oklahoma Sooners. And if you've been watching this channel, if you've been following this channel, you would know that I am super, super, super high on this Oklahoma Sooners football team because I have them currently as my national championship favorite. I have this team winning the national championship, and that is just how good I think this Oklahoma team is going to be this season. I have them being better than your Alabamas, being better than your Clemson, your Georgia, all those teams, your Ohio State. I have this Oklahoma team at the top of the top, and I am very, very excited to watch this team this season. Quarterback position, you had the best quarterback in all of college football, in my opinion, the Heisman favorite to this point. I think Spencer Rattler is leading the Heisman race right now. In preseason, I'd bet him as my favorite. Obviously, you're still going to have Sam Howell up there. You're going to have your Breece Hall. You're going to have your DJ Uiagalelei. You're going to have Bryce Young. You're going to have JT Daniels. You're going to have Matt Corral. All guys like that. I think that Spencer Rattler is atop all of those guys right now. Before the season has started, Spencer Rattler is my guy. Running back position for Oklahoma before we get talking about the wide receiver position. Running back position, nobody hit the transfer portal harder than Oklahoma did, and nobody won the transfer portal harder than Oklahoma did. And one of those guys that they got is Eric Gray, transfer from Tennessee, who will be one of the best all-purpose backs in all of college football, not only rushing the ball, but catching the ball too. Eric Gray will have a monster season, and then also pairing that with Kennedy Brooks out of the backfield for Oklahoma. Those two guys are going to have an absolute monster season. Then you go to the wide receiver position. You look at one of the best wide receivers in all of college football. You're looking at Marvin Mims. You look at Theo Weiss. Tons of talent all over the board for Oklahoma coming into the season. I am so excited to watch this offense this season. Even at the tight end position, you're looking at Jeremiah Hall, and then you're looking at Austin Stogner also there. So tons of guys to throw the ball to for Spencer Rattler. Tons of talent all across the board. Going defensively, and I think that this is where it really puts Oklahoma on the board and really does it over the top for me on why I think Oklahoma is going to be a national championship team at the end of the season. Defensively, I think Oklahoma has a top 3 defense in all of college football, and that's not something you usually hear coming out of the Big 12 or Oklahoma, especially because you look at their problems every single season in their bowl games and their college football playoff appearances. They could not compete against LSU's offense. They could not compete against Alabama's offense in terms of stopping them. I know they made it close late against Alabama in that 2018, the Orange Bowl. They made it close late. Kyler Murray made a good push at the end, but still, their defense just was not able to handle what Alabama was throwing at them. Same thing kind of with the Georgia game. Now, that game was a lot closer, but it's because Oklahoma's offense was able to score as much as Georgia's offense was able to score, but still, that game was high in the 50s, so still lots of work to do on the defense for those college football playoff appearances, but this is the Oklahoma team that I feel like has the defense to go up against those high-powered offenses in Alabama, in Clemson, in Georgia, in Ohio State, in maybe Iowa State. Ohio State and Iowa State. Sorry if I said Iowa State twice. You look at this defense. I think Nick Benito is one of the best defensive players in all of college football this season. Excited to see what he can do at the linebacker position this year. You look at the secondary. You look at Pat Fields. You look at Turner Yell. Tons of guys like that. You look at the defensive line. You got guys like Perrion Winfrey. You got guys like Isaiah Thomas. This defense as a whole is one of the best in all of college football, and I have no problem going out here and saying that. I have said that Oklahoma is going to be my national championship favorite team because of this defense. Not just because I think the offense is one of the best in all of college football, but when you pair that with the talent that this defense has, I think Oklahoma has something really, really special cooking this season. And it's I kind of talked about this already. It's kind of win now mode for Oklahoma, and it's kind of not, because even if Oklahoma doesn't win this year, I still think that they have the talent and everything coming in. You still have Caleb Williams obviously coming in at the quarterback position. in the next coming season. You're still going to have top recruiting classes every single season, but it really feels like if Oklahoma wants to be a national championship team anytime soon, it kind of has to be this season, because you have some serious talent and you have the best team to do it, in my opinion. So those are my Big 12 predictions. I appreciate you guys tuning in so much. Hit the like button down below, hit the sub button. That would mean a lot to me, as well as liking, as like what I said, liking and subscribing help me the most. Comment, I'd love to hear your guys' opinions on what your Big 12 predictions are. Thank you for watching, guys, and definitely come back next time.